The sun began to set behind the hills of Northern California, painting the sky a fiery orange. On the edge of a small coastal town, an imposing stone castle stood atop the cliffs, casting its shadow over the turbulent waters below. It was a place of luxury, but also one shrouded in secrets hidden behind closed doors. The Calloway family, wealthy and powerful, seemed to have everything money could buy. But behind their smiles and perfect appearances, a crack ran deep. A secret was about to be exposed. Julia Calloway, the only daughter of millionaire Charles Calloway, was 25 years old with a dazzling smile that could light up any room. She had grown up in a world of excess and comfort, but always felt something was missing. Her father's love seemed conditional, tied to his ideal of perfection. He was a man who did not tolerate flaws, viewing weakness as something to be eliminated, especially within his family. Despite having everything she could possibly want, Julia had always known that her relationship with her father was colder than she wished. He never approved of her independent spirit, much less her relationship with Alex, her fiancé, a skilled diver with a calm and humble demeanor. Charles Calloway, on the other hand, was ruthless. His ability to create wealth was matched only by his knack for crushing anyone who dared cross him. His relationship with his daughter had always been distant, especially after the death of his wife, which left him even more withdrawn. Despite her feelings of abandonment, Julia still sought her father's approval. She was willing to do anything to earn it. But that afternoon was different. It was the day of the family's trip to the submerged caves along the coast, a family tradition, but also a power play in which Julia found herself trapped, trying to please her father by embarking on the excursion. The trip was planned as a simple exploration, but the waters in the caves held a darker history. Rumors swirled about the treacherous currents in the depths and the cave's reputation for punishing those who disrespected it. To Charles, however, it was just another challenge to conquer. He thrived on making his own rules and demanded that his family follow his lead without question. "You need to trust me, Julia," he said with a forced smile before the expedition. "Nothing will go wrong." Alex, Julia's fiancé, was skeptical of the plan. He knew the environment was dangerous, that the caves could hide unforeseen traps. But he couldn't openly defy Julia without jeopardizing their relationship. They were the last family to board the boat heading to the cave's entrance, with Charles growing impatient by the second. The journey along the coast to the cave entrance was calm, but the tension in the air was palpable. Julia glanced at Alex's face, searching for reassurance, but his worry was evident. The man she called her father seemed unmoored, and every moment in his presence made her feel more estranged. Charles had always been demanding, but today he seemed to have something more sinister in mind. When they finally reached the cave entrance, the group prepared for the dive. The dark water reflected the lantern light, and the sound of waves echoed off the rocks. Everyone was equipped, but the atmosphere felt more threatening than ever. As usual, Charles led the way, followed by Julia, Alex, and the rest of the team. Hesitant, Julia was the last to enter the water. Alex followed closely, trying to offer an encouraging smile, but her unease remained. Something was wrong. And then it happened. As everyone entered the cave, Charles, with a cold and distant look in his eyes, shoved Julia into a crevice in the rock. The movement was swift, almost imperceptible. She had no time to react. In an instant, she was sucked into the icy waters, disappearing into the dark depths. Alex saw it happen, but couldn't act in time. Panic gripped him as he dove in immediately, knowing Julia's life was in danger. The crashing waves roared against the rocks as he swam toward the crevice, his movements quick and precise. But before he could reach the bottom, something unexpected occurred. The current, stronger than he anticipated, dragged him away from the cave entrance. His face was tense, his breath shallow, but he refused to give up. A deep rage ignited within him, a desire for vengeance against the man who had pushed his beloved toward death. At that moment, the diver became more than a man trying to save someone. He would become an agent of vengeance, determined to stand against the immense power of Charles Calloway. After the incident in the cave, the atmosphere along the California coast grew heavier than the icy waters threatening to swallow anyone daring to swim its depths. The once quiet, peaceful coastal town now became a stage for tension and mystery. The tragedy involving Julia Calloway spread quickly among the locals, but few knew the truth behind the attempted murder. Charles Calloway, the family patriarch, still held control. He was a man who never lost his composure, always manipulating situations to his advantage. The immense fortune he had built over the years remained intact, and his influence in the town ran deep. No one dared openly question him. It was this power he wielded to control the narrative after the incident. While Julia remained missing, he pressured the police to expedite the search, but his demeanor was far from genuinely concerned. To him, the tragedy was somewhat convenient. If his daughter were declared dead, he could rid himself of what he saw as a weakness in his life, the constant reminder of the wife he had lost years ago, and more recently, the woman he had envisioned replacing Julia. However, Alex wasn't willing to let his fiancée's father dictate the situation. From the moment he saw Julia pushed into the turbulent waters, he knew something far darker was at play. Charles hadn't acted by accident, not the way it appeared. It was cold and calculated. Alex knew he couldn't trust anyone, not even the local police, who feared going against such an influential man. Determined to uncover the truth, Alex dove headfirst into his own investigation. Heart pounding and lungs still tasting of salt water, he rushed to the hospital where Julia had been taken after being rescued. When he was finally allowed to see her, she was in critical condition, but alive. The doctors told Alex that Julia's body was exhausted, but that she would recover, physically at least. Her mind, however, was in deep shock. She couldn't recall what had happened in the cave, and the tension between her and her father seemed to have been erased, as if the memory of the attempted murder had been wiped away to protect her sanity. In the days that followed, Julia withdrew into a heavy silence. She felt torn, unable to process the truth about her father and what he had done. The anger building within her was new, something she had never known before. For years, she had been submissive to her father's authority, knowing deep down that he didn't see her as a true daughter, but rather as a pawn in his power games. Now, after the attempt on her life, Julia realized she could never see him the same way again. Alex, on the other hand, couldn't let go of what he believed to be the only truth, Charles's guilt. He knew he couldn't trust anyone else, and that, to save Julia and ensure the man who tried to kill her faced justice, he needed to uncover whatever else was being hidden. Both knew that Charles didn't just wield financial power, he had political and social connections as well. He was accustomed to using his wealth to silence and manipulate situations. But Alex was determined to bring the truth to light, no matter the cost. That's when he began delving into Charles Calloway's past. He discovered that the man who presented himself as the coastal magnate had a history of shady dealings, destroying rivals, and even manipulating his own family. Over the years, many people had disappeared without a trace. Friends, business partners, even family employees who had dared to challenge the patriarch. Every step Alex took brought him closer to a secret Charles wanted to keep buried. Each discovery only strengthened Alex's resolve to fight for Julia's justice. The town remained silent, but the truth was beginning to loom like a storm ready to break. Julia, meanwhile, began to remember fragments of what had happened in the cave. She knew something was wrong, but the pain and trauma kept her in a fog of confusion. The most painful realization, however, was that the man who was supposed to protect her was the one responsible for her suffering. Meanwhile, Charles Calloway watched everything with an almost unsettling calm. He knew questions about the incident in the cave would arise soon, and was prepared to spin them to his favor. Yet something told him that this time, things would be different. He sensed that Alex, with his determination and courage, wouldn't be so easily deceived. Perhaps, just perhaps, this was the greatest threat Charles had ever faced. The days following the attempted murder were dark for everyone, though in different ways. While Julia continued her recovery, Alex was racing against time, determined to uncover the truth about what had happened in the cave. He knew Charles Calloway wasn't an ordinary man. His ability to manipulate and control the world around him made any investigation a dangerous game. But Alex was willing to risk everything. He began operating in the shadows of the town, speaking to Charles's former allies and digging into suspicious dealings. Over the weeks, he uncovered not just a dark past, but also a web of influence that extended far beyond California's borders. Businessmen, politicians, even local police officers, all had ties to Calloway in one way or another. With each new clue, Alex felt the weight of a brutal truth forming before him. Charles Calloway hadn't just tried to kill Julia. He was deeply entrenched in illicit activities that had gone unnoticed by many. He had used his daughter as a pawn in his power games, always ready to sacrifice her when she was no longer useful. Now, the attempted murder in the cave wasn't just an accident, but a deliberate effort to eliminate an obstacle to his plans. Alex knew he needed to act fast. The investigation was beginning to draw attention, and Charles's name was starting to appear in reports from local journalists who were beginning to suspect a larger conspiracy. However, this also meant that Calloway was preparing his defense. His influence over the media and local authorities was immense. As Alex pieced together the puzzle, Julia began to sense a shift within herself. The initial shock had given way to anger. Her fragmented memories of the cave were starting to return, clearer now. She remembered her father's cold, disdainful look as he pushed her into the deep waters. How had she not seen it before? How could she have believed that the man who claimed to be her father was capable of anything but monstrous acts? The silence that had consumed Julia in the days following the incident began to crack, replaced by intense conversations with Alex. She knew she had to fight, to understand everything, even if it meant confronting her own father. "He's not going to get away with this, Julia. I promise," Alex said one night, frustration evident in his voice. He was clearly overwhelmed, but his determination had never been stronger. The truth had to come out, and he was going to make sure it did. Julia met his gaze, her eyes clouded with pain, but now holding something new, courage. I can't stay silent anymore. I can't pretend nothing happened." As their bond grew stronger, Charles Calloway's strategy was taking shape. He knew the situation was becoming untenable. Evidence against him was beginning to surface, and the pressure to explain the incident at the cave was mounting. But Charles was no stranger to adversity. He was calculating and knew how to manipulate situations to his advantage. One night, while Alex was combing through old documents in a hidden office in Charles's mansion, he heard a noise from the back door. Turning quickly, he saw a shadow move. Before he could react, a strong, mysterious man attacked him, someone who clearly had been sent by Charles. The fight was swift and brutal, but Alex, with his physical training and experience as a diver, managed to fend off the attacker. When the assailant realized he couldn't overpower Alex, he fled through the back door, leaving Alex with more questions than answers. One thing was clear. Charles knew Alex was closer to uncovering the truth than he'd ever imagined. From that moment, the battle between Alex and Charles wasn't just about uncovering what happened in the cave. It was a fight for survival. Alex understood the lengths Charles would go to protect his secrets, and as the investigation deepened, his resolve to bring justice not only for Julia, but for all of Calloway's victims grew stronger. Meanwhile, Julia was preparing for what she knew would be the fight of her life. She refused to be just another pawn in her father's game. The woman who had spent years trying to please her father and follow his rules was now ready to stand against him, not just for herself, but for everyone he had wronged over the years. She began collaborating with Alex, pulling together the information he uncovered, determined to expose Charles once and for all. Charles Calloway, on the other hand, was no longer at ease. He knew the walls were closing in. While he had always been meticulous, his secrets were now intertwining into a web that even he could no longer control. Alex's quest for vengeance was taking shape, and Julia was ready to be the catalyst to bring down the empire her father had built. As the pressure mounted, the battle for the truth intensified. Tensions in the small coastal town were higher than ever. Whispers about what really happened in the cave grew louder, and with each passing day, more people began to suspect that something was amiss with the Calloway family. Still, even with the investigation gaining traction, the truth felt agonizingly out of reach. Alex was aware he was being followed. Every move he made, every new lead he pursued, seemed to be monitored. When he approached independent journalists who had begun questioning the accident, he received a threatening message: "Stop now, or you'll regret it." It was a clear warning from Charles, proof of the patriarch's willingness to do anything to protect his secrets. But instead of deterring Alex, it spurred him on. He accelerated his pursuit of the truth, unaware that new forces were moving behind the scenes, forces he couldn't yet comprehend. Julia, meanwhile, felt more lost than ever. She knew she needed to confront her father, but the weight of his betrayal was overwhelming. He hadn't just tried to kill her, he had built her entire life on a lie. The burden of her father's manipulation made her feel like a stranger in her own story. Even so, she couldn't shake the feeling that there was more she didn't know, something her father had been hiding from the beginning. Her memories of the cave grew sharper, and she began to realize that being pushed to her death wasn't just an act of desperation. It was part of a deeper, more sinister plan. It was then that Julia had a revealing encounter with Margaret, her biological mother, who had passed away years ago. In life, Margaret had been a vibrant woman, deeply loved by Julia. Before her death, she had left a series of letters for her daughter, letters Julia had never read because Charles had hidden them away. Now, with a more open mind, Julia decided it was time to confront the words her mother had left behind. The letters were like pieces of a puzzle, painting a picture of Charles that Julia had never imagined. A cold, manipulative man who had used every resource at his disposal to build a life of luxury at the expense of others. Her mother's words described how Charles had constantly made her feel inferior, how the matriarch of the family had never been able to step out of his shadow. There was also a mention of a dark secret, something Julia would need to uncover to fully understand what was happening to her and her family. Meanwhile, Alex's investigation was taking unexpected turns. He had uncovered records of shady business dealings by Charles, involving construction contracts and bribes. But there was an even more dangerous connection. Alex discovered that Calloway was tied to a drug cartel, a cartel whose influence extended to local politicians and law enforcement. Alex began to realize that the magnate's power play went far beyond a simple murder attempt. Charles was entrenched in a criminal network that controlled the region. Through these discoveries, Alex came closer to an earth-shattering realization. The attempt on Julia's life might have been just one piece of a larger plan. Charles knew his daughter had started questioning his manipulation, and if she kept digging, his dangerous connections could be exposed. The attempt on her life wasn't merely about protecting Calloway's empire. It was about silencing any threat to his power. As Alex and Julia drew closer to the truth, the pressure became unbearable. Charles knew the noose was tightening, and he wasn't about to relinquish control over his life or his business. He escalated his counterattacks, bribes, threats, even attempts to manipulate the journalists who had started investigating him. One of the biggest challenges for Alex and Julia was managing their growing paranoia that anyone around them could be one of Charles's spies. The fear of constant surveillance intensified, forcing them to take drastic measures. They began communicating in secrecy, using encrypted devices, and being cautious with their movements. However, there was another layer of complexity, the strain on Alex and Julia's relationship as more truths came to light. Despite her anger and pain, Julia found herself torn. A part of her still wanted to believe that her father, for all his flaws, could find some redemption. Alex, on the other hand, was so focused on exposing Charles and ensuring he paid for his crimes that he grew more relentless by the day. The external pressures, the constant threat from Charles, and their own insecurities began driving a wedge between them. Julia started questioning whether she was truly ready to dismantle everything her father represented and if she could handle the fallout. She also worried about how far Alex was willing to go to uncover the truth, fearing that his obsession with vengeance might lead him to lose sight of what truly mattered. Julia's moral dilemma, her fear of confronting her father, and the desire to break free from his chains became a pivotal part of the conflict. As she delved deeper into her mother's letters, her doubts about the path forward only grew stronger. At the same time, Alex began to realize that his fight wasn't just for justice. He was fighting to save Julia from her father, and in doing so to save her from herself. Her reluctance to accept that vengeance might be the only way to overcome the pain she was living with. Night had fallen over the coastal town, and the atmosphere was thick with tension. Alex and Julia met in a secret location, a secluded cafe in the city center, where they discussed their next steps in uncovering the truth. They were closer than ever to exposing Charles Calloway, but something told them they couldn't trust anyone, not even their own shadows. "We have to dig deeper, Julia," Alex said in a hushed voice, his eyes darting around suspiciously. "Now we know he's involved in something much bigger, something far more dangerous than we thought. We can't afford any more missteps." Julia nodded, her face pale but resolute. Her mother's letters had shown her an even darker side of Charles, something she could barely bring herself to believe. But there was no time left for disbelief. She had to face the truth. And then something happened, something no one could have anticipated. As Alex tried to focus on the documents he had collected, his phone buzzed. An anonymous message appeared on the screen. The text was brief but loaded with meaning. "You're closer than you think. Go to Calloway's office. You have 30 minutes. The phone trembled in his hands. How did someone know what they were doing? Who had sent the message? And most importantly, who was watching them now? Alex turned to Julia, his instincts screaming that something was wrong. "We have to move now. Something's about to happen." The two of them hurried out of the cafe, not even glancing back. Whatever it was about to happen, and they needed to be ready. They knew the key to taking Charles down was hidden in his office, the epicenter of his shady dealings. They arrived at the Calloway mansion within minutes. The house was silent, but an oppressive atmosphere hung in the air. Alex forced the door open using a key he'd acquired during one of his investigations. They moved quickly through the mansion, sticking to the shadows. When they reached Charles's office, the door was slightly ajar. Alex pushed it open cautiously, and what they saw inside made their hearts skip a beat. Charles Calloway sat behind his massive mahogany desk, but he wasn't alone. Beside him stood a familiar figure, Margaret, Julia's mother, alive, but aged and with a weary expression. Julia froze, speechless, as if the ground had disappeared beneath her feet. "Margaret," Julia whispered, her voice trembling. Margaret looked at her with a sad smile. "I know, sweetheart, I know." A chill ran down Alex's spine. Something was off, but he hadn't expected this. He turned to Charles, who watched the scene with a cold smile, as if everything were perfectly under control. "She's alive?" Alex asked, disbelief thick in his voice. "Yes, she is," Charles replied calmly. "And now you're beginning to understand, aren't you?" Julia was in shock, unable to speak. How is this possible? You told me my mother was dead. You lied to me." Charles rose slowly and walked toward her. "I knew you'd find out someday, my daughter, but the timing wasn't right. Margaret became an obstacle in my way. When she started to uncover too much, I hid her away. I thought it would be safer that way." "You hid my mother?" Julia repeated, her shock morphing into anger. "You did all of this. You tried to kill me, and now you're telling me that—" "Yes," Charles interrupted firmly. "I did, because you became a threat. But it wasn't out of malice. It was necessary, Julia, for the good of our family, for the good of our empire. I couldn't let anyone, not even you, stand in the way of my plans. Alex realized the situation was growing more convoluted by the second. Charles Calloway's power play wasn't just about attempting to kill Julia. It was part of a much larger scheme. He had manipulated the entire family, and now it seemed he was prepared to eliminate anyone who dared oppose him. Not just Margaret, but even Julia herself. You're telling me my mother knew all of this? That she knew you planned to kill me? Julia asked, her voice now filled with bitterness. Margaret looked at her daughter with an expression that combined pain and understanding. I tried, Julia. I tried to protect you, but he was stronger than I was. I didn't know where to run. I thought staying hidden was the only way to keep you safe. Standing beside Julia, Alex felt the weight of every word spoken. The truth was unraveling before them, and with it, a new reality was emerging. Their battle wasn't just against Charles anymore. It was against an entire system of lies and manipulation that had shaped their lives. What had once seemed like a straightforward act of vengeance for Alex was becoming something far more significant and complex. Charles stepped closer to Julia, his gaze cold and calculated. Now you know the truth, Julia. The choice is yours. Continue your quest for revenge and destroy what remains of our family, or join me and preserve what's left of this empire. Alex tensed, ready for anything, but the look in Julia's eyes was something he would never forget. She was torn, but she knew she couldn't continue living under her father's shadow. I will destroy you, Charles, Julia said, her voice steady and unwavering. I will destroy everything you've built. The weight of the revelation, Julia's internal struggle, and Charles's ominous presence all pointed to an inevitable showdown. The tension in the room was almost tangible. Julia's words echoed with unshakable resolve. I will destroy you, Charles. She didn't know exactly how she would do it, but something inside her had shattered at that moment. The girl who once sought her father's love and approval was gone. Now, a woman stood before an empire of lies and corruption, determined to bring it all down. Alex watched her with a mix of concern and admiration. He knew Julia's journey wouldn't be easy, but she was finally finding her strength. He wanted to stand by her, yet he also knew the stakes were higher than ever. Charles was not a man to go down easily. His strength lay in manipulating those around him, treating everyone as pawns on a chessboard. You think you can destroy me, Charles said, his voice low and menacing. You don't know what you're doing, Julia. You can't win this fight. I'm stronger than you think. But for the first time, Julia didn't falter. She lifted her head, her stance firmer than ever. You might be strong, Charles, but I am more determined than you will ever be. The silence that followed was dense. Margaret's eyes, once filled with sadness and resignation, now seemed to reflect a glimmer of hope. She knew the decisive moment had arrived, and the Calloway family's fate was about to be sealed. Alex glanced at Charles, then at Julia. They were at the point of no return, and he could feel it in the air. We know what you've done, Charles. The only thing left now is justice. You're going to pay for your crimes. Charles, however, remained calm, almost too calm. You think you have any control over this situation, Alex? He asked, the cold smile still fixed on his face. All you've done is push Julia closer to the edge. You don't even know what's about to happen. And as always, Julia, you're doing everything wrong. Julia didn't react to the taunt. Her anger wasn't just aimed at her father anymore. It was also at the version of herself that had allowed all this to happen. She knew he would never surrender, that Charles would die defending his empire tooth and nail. But Julia was no longer willing to let her life be shaped by his lies. I'm not the girl you used to manipulate, Charles, she said firmly. I see you for who you are, and I know no one else will fall for your lies again. Alex felt the weight of her words, and their impact was immediate. Charles seemed to lose a bit of his confidence. He wasn't as self-assured as before, and Alex realized they were on the right track. Still, the problem wasn't just Charles. There was something even more dangerous lurking. The system he had built around himself, a web of allies, bribes, and threats that would try to silence anyone who dared to challenge the patriarch. You think you're going to expose all of this? Charles laughed, now more of a shadowy threat than a man. "You have no idea what's at stake here. I control this city, everything and everyone in it. When you mess with the Calloway family, you're messing with something far bigger than you can imagine." But before he could continue, a series of shouts echoed through the mansion. Not just any shouts, but desperate cries from outside, near the main entrance. The sound cut the conversation abruptly, and everyone in the room turned toward the office door. Alex moved quickly to the window, trying to grasp what was happening. The chaos outside was unmistakable. "Something's not right," he said, his expression growing darker. "This can't just be a coincidence." "Let's go, now," Julia commanded. She knew it was time to act. The confrontation with Charles could no longer wait. But she also understood that the consequences of this moment would be far-reaching. As they rushed out of the office, Alex and Julia moved through the mansion's hallways, careful to avoid any traps. What happened next was something no one could have predicted. One of Charles's most trusted guards appeared at the entrance, gun in hand. "I thought you were smarter than this, Julia," the guard said, his sinister smile revealing his intentions. "But you've just signed your death warrant." Before he could fire, Alex reacted instinctively, lunging forward and disarming the man in one swift motion. The confrontation, though brief, was a stark reminder that Charles wasn't bluffing. He was willing to do whatever it took to silence his daughter and her ally. During the scuffle, Julia realized something crucial. It wasn't just Charles protecting his empire. It was the entire system he had built around him. If she wanted to bring him down, she would have to dismantle the entire network of influence he had cultivated over the years. It was a daunting, dangerous task. Alex looked at her, his eyes reflecting the urgency of the situation. "Are you ready for this, Julia?" She took a deep breath, feeling the weight of her decision. She wanted nothing more than to end Charles's reign of terror. But now, she understood the battle ahead would be even more grueling. This wasn't just about revenge, it was about reclaiming her life and finding her freedom. "I'm ready," Julia replied firmly. "Let's finish this." The air was thick with tension. After Charles's failed attempt to intimidate Julia and Alex, the dynamics between the characters had reached a breaking point. What had initially seemed like a battle between father and daughter was now evolving into something much bigger, involving a complex web of alliances and secrets. The Calloway Empire wasn't just a financial construct, it was a network of relationships built on lies and betrayal, the foundation upon which Charles had risen to power. Julia understood that the fight for truth and justice wouldn't be simple. With every step forward, new revelations emerged, showing that Charles's power wasn't just about his wealth, but also his political connections and the backing of influential figures he skillfully manipulated. She felt the weight of her past, of everything he had done to her and her mother, but she knew the future was at stake. With each passing moment, she came closer to her own redemption. Alex, by her side, seemed to grasp the enormity of the struggle. Julia's passion to dismantle Charles's empire motivated him, but there was something deeper in his gaze, a sense of urgency that made him question whether they were truly prepared for what lay ahead. With every move Charles made, another layer of complexity was revealed. The man always seemed one step ahead. "Julia, you have to be careful," Alex said in a hushed voice, watching from a distance as Charles and his allies moved about. "He's not just your father anymore. He's a figure of power. There are people around him who would do anything to protect what he represents." Julia took a deep breath. She knew this, but there was no turning back. The pain he had caused was unbearable, but something even stronger now burned within her. A need to expose the truth, to bring Charles down once and for all. As the battle intensified, the landscape around them began to shift. Julia's support was growing. Margaret, her mother, who had once been silent, was now finding the strength to act. The woman who had been crushed under years of Charles's abuse was finally awakening. She, who had once feared confronting the truth, was now willing to stand by her daughter in the fight for freedom. "I made a mistake, Julia," Margaret said, her voice low but filled with unexpected resolve. "I should have done this years ago. I should have protected you instead of hiding. It's not too late, Mom. We're in this together now, and we're going to end it." Margaret knew the consequences would be immense. She didn't have Julia's youthful energy or Alex's vigor, but her life-earned wisdom was undeniable. She was beginning to see that revenge wasn't their sole motivation. What was at stake now was much greater. Freedom, the possibility of a new beginning, a life no longer enslaved by Charles's lies. But a new layer of complexity emerged in the form of Ethan, Julia's younger brother. Until now, he had been absent from the equation, but he appeared unexpectedly. Ethan, who had always been the one Charles protected most, a young man who grew up under his father's shadow, was on the brink of making a crucial decision. When he arrived at the mansion, his expression was tense but determined. He knew what was happening, understood the silent war unfolding behind the scenes, but he didn't want to take sides, or at least he didn't want to admit he had already chosen one. "I don't know what you're getting yourself into, Julia," he said, his voice tinged with hesitation. "Charles isn't going to let this slide. He'll destroy everything you and Alex have built, and you, Mum, you're letting her fool you." Margaret, listening to the conversation from afar, looked at her son with sadness. "Ethan, you don't understand. This has never been just about what he's done, but about what he's still capable of doing." Julia wasn't sure if she was more frustrated by her brother's ignorance or pained by the realization that he was still under Charles's control. "Can't you see the truth, Ethan? He's manipulating you. But you have to choose. Are you on his side or ours?" Ethan averted his gaze as if waging an internal battle. I just don't want to be part of this anymore. I don't know what's harder, facing your revenge or living with the guilt of having helped him." Before the conversation could continue, the sound of a slamming door cut through the air. Someone was coming, another one of Charles's allies. The sense of danger was palpable, the atmosphere charged with a pressure that could erupt at any moment. "Let's go now," Alex urged, grabbing Julia's arm. "There's no time for hesitation." They knew the final confrontation was imminent. Time was running out, and their world was about to be irreversibly transformed. The fight for truth would be grueling, but victory lay not in revenge. It lay in the future they could finally build, free from the shadows of the past. As they moved forward to face what was coming, Julia reflected on the words of her mother, Alex, and even Ethan. She realized that in the end, the real war wasn't against Charles or his allies. The true battle was against everything she had ever believed to be true, against the ghosts of her past that still haunted her. Now more than ever, she had to be strong. The future was in her hands. The sun was setting, painting the sky in shades of orange and red, mirroring the turmoil within the Calloway mansion. Julia, Alex, and Margaret prepared for the final stage of their plan. Fear and anxiety hung thick in the air, but so did an unyielding determination. The house was silent, yet the tension was deafening. They had gathered all the evidence they could against Charles. They were ready to expose him once and for all, to end his reign of manipulation. However, something was about to change, something no one could have foreseen. "Are you sure we're doing this the right way?" Alex asked, watching Julia as she sat at the table, her expression focused. He admired her courage, but feared what might happen when everything was revealed. The cost of failure would be steep. Julia lifted her gaze, her face now a mask of resolve. "We don't have a choice anymore. If we don't act now, we'll never get another chance to break free from him." But deep down, there was a slight tremor in her voice. She felt something was off, a nagging premonition she couldn't shake. The plan was nearly complete, but the pieces were moving with a sinister rhythm. When they glanced out the window, the street was empty, eerily silent. No movement, no patrols. It wasn't normal for a man like Charles to leave his fortress unguarded for so long. "Something's not right," Julia murmured as she approached the window. She peered outside, her eyes fixed on the shadows stretching across the sidewalk. "I feel it too," Alex replied, his expression tense. He didn't want to say it out loud, but whatever was coming, it wasn't good. It's all been too easy. The meeting room door swung open abruptly, cutting their conversation short. It was Ethan. His face was pale, his eyes wide, as if he'd just seen a ghost. "Julia, Alex, you need to see this," he said breathlessly, with a worry in his voice that he had never shown before. "See what?" Julia asked, a chill running down her spine. Ethan's behavior was unsettling. He was always composed, but now he seemed terrified. Ethan hesitated before answering, his voice barely above a whisper. "Charles. He knows everything." The revelation hit like a bombshell. The plan was on the verge of being exposed. What else did Charles know? How could he have discovered something so carefully hidden? "No, that's impossible," Alex said, incredulous. "We've kept everything under wraps. How could he have found out?" "I don't know, but it's worse than that. He knows about you, Julia. He knows about the conversation we had this morning," Ethan said, his voice trembling. Julia froze, shock washing over her. How could he possibly know? They had taken every precaution to ensure no one, not even Charles's spies, would learn of her decision to confront him. "So, what's he going to do?" Julia asked, her voice low and serious. The fear she had been holding back now began to take over. The situation was unraveling in a way she had never anticipated. "He already has. It's happening now," Ethan replied, his voice almost inaudible. "He's coming after you. The house is surrounded." Julia and Alex's hearts raced. Ethan's words weren't just a hollow threat. They were being hunted. "We can't leave now." "Not yet," Alex said, clenching his fist. "Not until we've secured the evidence. If we're caught now, it's all over." But they didn't know the real surprise was about to unfold. As the conversation continued, a sound from outside broke the tense silence. The door to the room swung open forcefully, and a figure appeared in the doorway. It was Charles. But this wasn't the Charles they knew. His eyes were empty, distant. His face was drawn, as though he was carrying the weight of the world on his shoulders. Julia shivered as he stepped into the room, his movements slow, like he was dragging invisible chains. "You still don't understand, do you, Julia?" Charles's voice was softer than she'd ever heard it. Gone was the usual arrogance, the commanding presence that had always dominated the room. There was fragility in his words, as though he was lost. "You really think you can defeat me? That's not how this works," he continued, his voice cracking. "I know everything. I know you've been trying to destroy me, but you can't destroy what's already dead." Julia, now baffled, tried to make sense of what was happening. The man in front of her wasn't the same one who had manipulated her life for years. He seemed defeated. "You don't know anything," Julia said, her voice taut with frustration. "You don't control anything anymore." Charles smirked, but it was a bitter, hollow expression. "I never wanted to control you, Julia. You're the only real thing I have, and you're the reason for all of this. I didn't want it to end this way, but there's no going back." That's when the true revelation struck. Charles's empire wasn't about to collapse because of Julia's vengeance. He had already lost control of everything, even his own life. Deep down, he knew he was being consumed by his own greed and guilt. His death, whether literal or metaphorical, was inevitable. He wasn't fighting to maintain power anymore. He was fighting to bury the remains of a past filled with irreparable crimes. The battle for truth and justice wasn't just in Julia's hands. What Charles was trying to protect was already gone. The air in the room was heavy, as though the tension itself had taken on physical weight. Julia watched Charles, standing before her in what seemed like despair. He had once been a man of power, always calculated, always confident that nothing could destroy the empire he'd built. But the man in front of her now was different. The arrogant gleam in his eyes was gone, replaced with a hollow aura of defeat. "You don't understand," he said again, his voice weak, barely a whisper. "I did all of this for us, for you, Julia." The mention of us made her stomach turn. For years, he had manipulated her, weaponizing her love and her mistakes against her. What he called doing it for her was, in reality, a meticulously crafted prison. Julia took a step forward, locking eyes with Charles, her gaze unwavering. "You did it all for yourself, Charles. There's no us in this. There's only you and what you did to all of us." He lowered his head, unable to meet her gaze. It was as if, somehow, his confession wasn't enough to ease his pain. "You think you can bring me down like this? You can't, Julia. I'm invincible." Alex, who had remained silent until that moment, stepped closer to Julia, placing a reassuring hand on her shoulder. He knew that despite Charles' apparent fragility, they were still dealing with a dangerous man. Time was running out, and action was needed. "He's trying to manipulate the situation again. We can't fall for it," Alex said firmly. Julia took a deep breath, forcing herself to push away the anger simmering inside her. She knew the fight was far from over. "You're right, Alex," she replied, her tone resolute. "He's still trying to play his games, but this time, he won't win." The tension was interrupted when the door to the room suddenly burst open. Margaret entered, her face etched with worry. She looked more flustered than usual, her eyes locking onto Charles with urgency. "It's not just him, Julia," Margaret said, her voice shaking. I found something that changes everything." A shiver ran down Julia's spine. What did Margaret mean? What could possibly be more pressing at this moment? Margaret approached, her hands trembling slightly as she held out a file. "I found a document, a secret record. It's filed under Charles's name, but the signature, it's not his. It's Michael's." Julia froze, the words hitting her like a tidal wave. Michael, her biological father, the man she had believed was dead, the man whose memory she had clung to for years. I don't understand," Julia murmured, her mind racing. "This can't be my father. I don't know, Julia," Margaret interrupted, her voice hurried. "But this is serious. It looks like your father never died. Or if he did, it was long after you were taken into Charles' custody. He's been hiding something big, something that could ruin him." Margaret's words tumbled out in a rush, as if the weight of her discovery was overwhelming. "The file is full of information that could bring Charles down, and it's not just about your father. It's tied to a massive financial operation, one we never saw coming." Alex shifted his gaze between Margaret and Julia, his expression a mix of disbelief and apprehension. "Are you saying that Charles's empire wasn't entirely built by him, that there's more to this story?" Margaret nodded, clearly struggling to piece everything together herself. "I don't have all the answers yet, but it's clear that everything Charles has done was part of a much bigger scheme. He wasn't just hiding what he did to you, Julia. He was covering up the biggest mistake of his life." Julia turned her eyes back to Charles, but this time her expression was different. It was no longer just anger. There was something else, an undercurrent of sadness, perhaps even pity. Charles was still a part of the puzzle, and she couldn't let him slip away. He had destroyed so much of her life, but now the tables were turning. "Do you have anything to say about this, Charles?" Julia asked, her voice steady but tinged with sorrow. "Are there more secrets you're hiding?" Charles remained silent, his shoulders slumped under the weight of his own guilt. He looked defeated, yet Julia knew better. Even a broken man could be dangerous. I did what I did because I couldn't lose control," Charles finally admitted, his voice cracking. "But now, seeing everything you're doing, maybe it's already too late." Alex leaned in closer to Julia and whispered, "He's not in control anymore. What we need to do now is dismantle everything he's built and make sure he pays for all of it." Julia didn't need further convincing. The revelations were too significant to ignore. This wasn't just about personal vengeance anymore. It was about justice, for her past, for her father, and for the truth that had been buried for so long. The air in the Calloway mansion was thick with tension. Julia, Alex, Margaret, and even Ethan stood on the brink of unraveling a mystery none of them could have anticipated. The discovery about her father, Michael, had shifted the entire game. Julia felt an odd mix of emotions: rage, pain, and a newfound determination. Charles's empire was crumbling, but the real battle lay ahead. Whatever the truth about her father was, it was time to uncover it and finally take control of her own story. She stepped forward, her gaze locked on Charles. "I thought I wanted revenge, Charles," she said, her voice calm yet firm. "But now I realize that exposing the truth is what really matters. You won't hide behind your lies anymore." Charles looked at her, his face etched with defeat. The man who had once wielded power so effortlessly now seemed crushed beneath the weight of his own actions. Julia saw it, his fragility, his brokenness. For a moment, she felt a flicker of compassion. But the anger, the pain he had caused, was still too great to ignore. The pieces were falling into place, and Julia was ready to face whatever came next. Charles had played his last hand, and now it was her turn. "You don't understand, Julia," Charles murmured, his voice breaking. "I was forced to do what I did. You have no idea what it's like to lose everything." Julia took a deep breath and stepped away from Charles, feeling an overwhelming need to put some distance between them. Anger and pain swirled within her. It wasn't just about him anymore. It was about her own story, the reflection of who she had become, and the unbearable weight of it all pressing down on her. Alex noticed the tension between them and quickly stepped closer to Julia. He could see the internal battle she was fighting. The revelation about her father had changed everything. This was no longer just a battle against Charles. It was a battle within herself, against the ghosts of her past. She had the power to bring down Charles's empire, but doing so would mean destroying everything she thought she knew about her own life. "You're not alone, Julia," Alex said, looking her directly in the eyes. "We're with you. No matter what happens now, you have a future ahead of you." Those simple words touched something deep inside Julia. She had lost so much, but now, with Alex and Margaret by her side, she began to understand that true vengeance wasn't in destroying Charles or exposing his secrets. True vengeance lay in her own growth and resilience. She had been a victim for so long, but now she had the power to choose her own path, to write her own story. With a determined look, Julia turned to Margaret and Ethan, who had been silently observing the confrontation. "We're going to expose everything," she said, her voice steady and strong. "The truth is coming out, and I won't let Charles control anyone else ever again. I'll bring my father's story to light, and with that, I'll take down his empire." Margaret nodded with a proud smile. "You're ready for this. We'll do it together." Ethan, who had remained quiet until now, stepped forward as well. "I know it's hard, Julia. I know this is a path you never wanted to take, but you have a chance to change everything. You're not alone." A wave of strength and clarity washed over Julia. She had never realized just how much she needed their help, how much she needed the truth to finally set her free. Now she wasn't carrying the weight of the ghosts alone. She had allies, and more importantly, she had the truth on her side. "I won't live under Charles's shadow anymore. I won't be a victim," she said, more to herself than anyone else. "I'll fight for what's mine, for what's ours." Julia's words marked a turning point in her own transformation. She was no longer the fragile young woman afraid to confront her stepfather. She was no longer a daughter seeking approval or redemption. She was now a strong woman who understood that true victory didn't come from destroying someone else, but from rebuilding herself. The real triumph would be hers, not because she brought Charles down, but because she freed herself from everything the past represented. Through her eyes, Alex, Margaret, and Ethan could see the change. Julia was finally ready to take control of her life and decide her own fate. She knew the road ahead would be long and full of challenges, but she was willing to face them. This moment marked the beginning of a new chapter for her, a chapter where she was no longer a victim, but the protagonist of her own story. "Let's go," Julia said, turning to the others with a determined look. "It's time to put an end to this." The next morning arrived with a palpable sense of change in the air. Julia, Alex, Margaret, and Ethan had spent the entire night organizing the documents and preparing for the final confrontation. It was no longer just about taking down Charles or exposing his secrets. Now, there was something much deeper at stake. The search for the truth, for her father's identity, and most importantly, for liberation from a past that had imprisoned her for so long. Julia knew she was about to make decisions that would forever alter the course of her life. The file Margaret had discovered, the one suggesting her father was alive and had been manipulated by Charles, wasn't just a key to destroying her stepfather's empire. It was a key to her own identity, the missing piece she needed to understand who she truly was. She was no longer just the stepdaughter Charles had tried to control, or the woman at the mercy of his decisions. She was someone with a past, a legacy, and now, with the right allies by her side, she was ready to face anything. "I can't believe we're about to do this," Alex said, looking at the papers spread across the table with a tense expression. "You're right, Julia. Charles has to pay for everything, but we need to be ready. None of this will be easy." Julia lifted her head and met his gaze. She understood what he meant. They were dealing with a man without scruples, someone who would do anything to protect his secrets. But what scared and motivated her most was the thought of finally finding answers about her father. She wondered, what had happened to him? Why had Charles hidden his true identity for so long? If he was still alive, where was he? What had happened during his absence? "I know it won't be easy, Alex," Julia replied, with a firmness she didn't even recognize in herself. "But I won't stop until I find the truth, and I'm sure that truth is going to be the turning point. Not just for me, but for all of us." Margaret walked over to the table, holding a document in her hands. She seemed calmer than usual, as if the weight of what they were about to do had given her a new perspective. "Here's what we need. Michael Calloway's name doesn't appear by accident. There are financial records, agreements, and a series of transactions that suggest he had a direct role in Charles's biggest investments. But somehow, he was left out of the official records. It's as if he was erased." Julia felt the weight of these words. The presence of her father, or at least what was left of him, was somehow intertwined with Charles's empire. If Michael had been hidden, it was because he still held crucial importance. The truth behind this mystery had the power to destroy not only Charles, but also the lies that had been built around Julia's life. "So, what do we do now?" Ethan asked, interrupting her thoughts. "Are you ready to reveal everything?" Julia looked at him, feeling a wave of gratitude. Ethan had been her anchor, the friend who had always been by her side, and now he was ready to go through it all with her until the end. "Yes, I need to see this story through. I won't stop now." They had everything they needed: the financial records, the evidence linking Michael to Charles, and the proof that her stepfather's empire wasn't just built on lies, but on crimes and manipulation. But there was still one last obstacle: Charles. They knew it wouldn't be enough to just present the documents. Charles wouldn't give up easily. He had power, influence, and connections, and as always, he was clever enough to try to turn the tables on them. Julia knew this. She knew her battle wouldn't be fought with words or documents alone. They needed to do more. They needed to act strategically. "Let's gather all the material and take it to the authorities," Julia said with renewed confidence. "We can't let Charles use his influence to silence this. If he tries to stop us, we'll expose every single one of his secrets, not just him, but everyone involved in this scheme." Margaret looked at Julia with a respectful smile. "You have a very clear vision now. I'm with you." The team was ready. All they needed now was an opportunity, a moment of vulnerability where Charles couldn't control the narrative. But the feeling that this moment was coming soon left Julia with a mix of apprehension and excitement. She knew she couldn't hesitate. Once the truth was revealed, there would be no turning back. The afternoon began to fall, and the preparations were complete. Julia felt a calmness inside her, as if she were about to take a decisive step in her journey. Looking at her friends and allies, she realized that finally she had a clear purpose. She was no longer at the mercy of a man who had tried to shape her to his will. She was taking control of her life and her story. Now, she needed to take the final step, the confrontation. The clock was ticking. Julia knew the fight wasn't anywhere near over, but deep down, she also knew that nothing could stop her now. The end of Charles Calloway's era was coming, and with it, a new beginning for all of them. The moment finally arrived. Julia felt her heart racing as she approached Charles's office. The tension in the air was almost palpable. She looked at Alex, Margaret, and Ethan, who were by her side, ready to face the man who, for so many years, had controlled their lives. The evidence was there. The documents, the financial records, the transactions linking Michael Calloway, her real father, to the web of manipulation and crimes that Charles had carefully woven to maintain his control. Now, all she needed was to confront him with the truth. Charles's office, with its dark wood-paneled walls and polished mahogany desk, felt like a fortress of power. But Julia knew that his stronghold was about to crumble. She had planned every move, every detail. Everything needed to be perfect. Charles was sitting there behind his desk, his expression cold and distant, as if nothing was happening. Julia took a deep breath and walked in, her footsteps echoing in the large room. He looked at her, recognizing the determination in her eyes. "Julia," he said, his voice soft, almost as if trying to seem approachable. "You're still determined to do this, aren't you? To destroy everything we've built together?" She didn't answer immediately, her breath still controlled. She was no longer interested in empty words, promises of reconciliation, or attempts at manipulation. That conversation had ended long before it even started. "I'm not here to destroy anything that wasn't built on lies and manipulation," she said firmly, looking him directly in the eyes. "I'm here to expose the truth." Charles raised an eyebrow, a sly smile forming on his lips. "The truth? What truth do you think can change what we've built? You don't know anything about what's behind this empire, Julia. You think you can just tear it all down with a handful of papers?" "I know more than you think, Charles," Julia said, pulling the documents from her bag that had been carefully prepared. She placed them on the table deliberately, the papers slowly unfolding, revealing the details of the financial transactions involving her father, Michael Calloway. "These papers don't lie, they tell everything." Charles's smile disappeared instantly. He stared at the documents with a look of surprise, followed by a wave of anger. "You don't know what you're doing, Julia. You don't understand what's at stake here." But she did know. She understood perfectly. Each signature, each transfer of money, each connection that linked her father to Charles was a piece of the puzzle that finally made sense. The truth was finally before her, clear and undeniable. "I know exactly what's going on, Charles. You killed my father. Not physically, but you destroyed his life, my mother's life and mine. All because of your own ego and obsession with power. You used me, manipulated everything, and now you're paying for it." Charles was silent for a moment. He looked at the documents with a look of despair, and Julia could see that he knew there was no escaping it anymore. But before he could say anything, Julia continued, "You made me believe that my father abandoned me, that he was dead, or worse, that he never wanted to know me. But you hid the truth, Charles. He was alive all along, and what you did to him, what you did to me, is unforgivable." He stood up, rage now visible on his face. "You're a fool, Julia. If you think you're going to walk out of here a winner, you're wrong. You're throwing your future away." Julia felt a chill as she heard his words, but now there was no fear. She was beyond that. She knew that the revenge she sought wasn't about destruction, but about justice, and justice was relentless. "I've already lost everything because of you, Charles, but I won't lose my dignity. I won't let you destroy me too. What you did was cruel, but you never understood how strong people can be, even when everything seems lost." And then Charles's phone rang, interrupting the rising tension in the room. He answered quickly, his eyes fixed on Julia, but she didn't fear him anymore. The conversation was brief, and he seemed more disturbed with each passing second. After hanging up, he looked at her, his expression completely different. "You have more allies than you think, Julia. I know what you're trying to do, and I can guarantee this isn't going to end well for you. This is going to destroy your life. You'll see." Julia just watched him. She knew Charles's threats were empty. He was losing control. The manipulation he'd always had over others was starting to fade. He knew now that the castle of lies he had built was about to crumble. "You still don't understand, Charles. The only thing you've lost is your humanity. Julia said, with a calmness that seemed to disarm him. "I'm his daughter, and I won't let you continue with this farce." Charles moved toward the table in an angry gesture, but before he could make any move, the door swung open abruptly. Alex, Margaret, and Ethan entered, bringing more documents and information, more proof that Charles's empire was built on a foundation of lies and crimes. The pressure was finally becoming unbearable. "It's time, Charles," Alex said, his voice firm. "Justice will be done, no matter how hard you try to hide." It was in that moment that Julia realized the battle was about to be won, not through force or violence, but through the truth. The truth, after all, always finds a way to the light. The truth had finally been exposed. Charles Calloway, the man who had manipulated so many lives and destroyed so many hopes, was now on his knees before the reality of his actions. There was no room for lies or subterfuge anymore. The empire he had built on deception was crumbling before his eyes, and with it, his influence, power, and ability to control those around him. Julia watched, a mixture of relief and sadness, as the police arrived, accompanied by a lawyer who knew exactly what to do with the papers and evidence that she and her allies had gathered. The truth was irrefutable. Michael Calloway's name had been brought to light, and Julia's identity as his daughter had been recognized. Charles's manipulation to keep the empire clean and his fortune intact had been exposed. The symbolic death of her father, which she had always believed was abandonment, was now a painful blow, but the scar was healing with the discovery of her true identity. The room was filled with a heavy silence as Charles was led away by the police, his expression of fury transformed into a mixture of despair and defeat. He didn't say a word, but Julia knew the consequences of his actions had arrived. There was no more escaping. His world was collapsing, and as she looked at him for the last time, Julia felt a sense of powerlessness. It wasn't about revenge, but about justice that had taken too long to come. Margaret, Ethan, and Alex were by her side, sharing that moment of victory with a quiet calm. They had been her pillars throughout the entire journey, and now the weight of the lies was finally being lifted. It was a collective victory, but especially Julia's. A victory over the past and over the man who had tried to manipulate her throughout her life. "You did it, Julia," Ethan said, his face breaking into a proud smile. "You made it." Julia looked at him, a shy smile forming on her lips. "We did it. I couldn't have done this without all of you." She felt a peace she never thought she would be able to find. Charles's empire was nothing anymore. His fortune, his assets, his reputation, it was all about to be restructured, dismantled, and revealed as a facade of lies. But for Julia, the most important thing wasn't Charles's downfall, but her own rise, the rebirth of her identity, her autonomy, and the awakening to what she could truly become, far from the shadow of the stepfather who had controlled her life. Charles's lawyer was seen leaving the room, instructing the police to take the case to court. The case was far from over. The investigations would be long and the trials drawn out. But the truth was now out there. And the story she had long sought to understand about her father, Michael Calloway, was about to be uncovered. "I want to know where he is," Julia said firmly to the investigators. "My father, Michael Calloway. I want to understand what happened to him." She felt a surge of determination, a strength of will she never knew she had. Now, she wasn't just searching for answers for herself, but also for everyone who had been a victim of Charles's web of lies. Margaret placed her hand on Julia's shoulder, smiling with silent pride. "We'll find everything, Julia, and then finally you'll have all the answers." Deep down, Julia knew the battle was far from over. Charles still had many allies, and the legal process would be long and complicated. But the worst was behind her. She wasn't alone anymore. She had her own path to follow, a new identity, and the freedom to live her life the way she chose. What awaited her in the future? Julia didn't know, but one thing was certain. She would no longer be defined by the shadows of Charles Calloway. She had her own story now, and that story was just beginning. Months passed since Charles Calloway's downfall. Julia was now living her life with a peace she never thought she would reach. The investigations into Michael Calloway finally revealed the truth. Her father, although deeply scarred by Charles's manipulation, was alive, but had chosen to stay away to protect Julia, fearing that his presence would only strengthen Charles's control over her. After years of suffering, Julia now understood the sacrifice he had made out of love. Though the chapter of revenge was over, a new journey was just beginning. Julia's life would be her own, and she finally had control. Now that Julia's story has come to an end, it reminds us of the power of truth and the strength we can find within ourselves, even when the world seems to crush us. What would you do in her place? How would you react upon discovering that you had spent years believing in lies? I invite you to reflect on the courage to face your greatest fears and the pursuit of justice, even when everything seems lost. If this story touched your heart, share it with others who need to believe in the strength of truth and the importance of never giving up.